Hi, Misha here, and kind of continuing to look at American fighter jets and propeller planes. Thought today to kind of do something a little different and look at the Republic F-84 Thunderjet, the other major jet fighter of the Korean War. And I have two models here, both from Skymax. The one on the spinner is the F-84E, and the one over here, very similar, but since I had both, I thought I'd bring both out. This is kind of the ultimate version. This is the F-84G. And while, the F-86 Sabre from North American is pretty much the acknowledged fighter of the Korean War. And that's because it was the air superiority fighter, the dog fighter. It got all the glory. The F-84, on the other hand, was a fighter, bomber, or strike aircraft. So it really filled a different role. It's also a older design that dates back to the end of World War II. Well, in 1944, Republic had great success with their P-47 Thunderbolt, a very large, durable, tough, well-armed and armored combat aircraft that was pretty dominant until the P-51 came onto the scene. And they looked at it and they thought, hey, these newfangled jet engines that the Brits are starting to use, the Germans are using, and of course America was working first with the P-59 and later the P-80. They thought, we'll try to take the basic P-47 design and make it a jet. Well, they quickly realized that the early jet engines, the size, the dimensions, they just wouldn't fit into the P-47 body. So they ended up having to go to a clean sheet model. Just start over. So they just started work, and then in September of that year, the U.S. Army Air Forces released requirements for a new daytime fighter, jet-powered. They could go at least 600 miles per hour, have a range of over 700 miles, so on and so forth. In November, so just a couple of months later, after Republic had kind of shown them their work, they awarded them a contract to produce 3 XP-84 prototypes. Now, there was no design phase, there was no competition. It was just felt that this would be a superior plane to the P-80 Shooting Star, and that since Republic had experience with the P-47, they were a good fit. And again, we're still in wartime. Well, in January, the order was added to. They decided they wanted 25 YP-84A pre-production test models and 75 P-84B full production models. This order was very quickly modified to 15 and 85 respectively, so fewer test models, more production models. So, with the contract in hand in 1945, Republic got underway, manufacturing the first prototype, and it flew as the XP-84 on February 28th of 1946, and the second prototype flew in August of that year. And shortly thereafter, the YP-84As would be built. And the big difference would just be a more powerful engine. Also, the YPs would be armed. Initially, the Air Forces would require either 6 50 caliber machine guns or 4 larger caliber machine guns, such as 15 millimeter. Well, the Republic guys went with the tried and tested Browning. So the YP F-84s would have guns. They would also start to introduce these fuel tanks on the wings that have kind of become iconic for this design, wingtip tanks. And then in 1947, the P-84B, the full production model, would go into production. And there was basically no real difference between it and the YP-84A, except for the machine guns were tweaked a bit and a few other minor changes. And this would actually be an issue. While they had test models, they had not undergone a lot of flight testing and refinement before the B production models came off the assembly line. They were officially adopted in November of 47, and the first squadron was considered to reach initial operational readiness in December of that year. There was a rush, of course, because of Cold War tensions. And quickly there were a lot of problems. This was a pretty conventional design. As you see, it is a straight wing, meaning really early on the only advancements this had was the fact that it has a jet engine, but it was also using a late World War II pattern of jet engine, so early jet, meaning relatively low power. It did have a tricycle landing gear, that's pretty modern, and it was created to go quite fast for that day and time, but again, aircraft were quickly advancing. Early on, many issues were noticed, especially with where they were experiencing problems with buffeting and twisting, torquing, all kinds of issues when accelerating rapidly or going over Mach 0.8. Also had some issues with altitude, and these wing tanks were really causing hell, giving torque and just all kinds of goofinesses. So there was a review in 1948, and this project was almost dead. The fleet was grounded in May of that year. The Air Force looked it over. The F-86 Sabre was coming online, and they almost pulled it. They didn't because of this model's predecessor. Republic had already designed many improvements, becoming the F-84D in 1949. Now, speaking of the difference between P and F, the designation from pursuit to fighter happened in 1947. Also, the Air Force became independent from the Army. They really went with this design over the P/F-80 Shooting Star because it was faster and it could carry a much heavier payload, and it had better climbed altitude. And by the D, they were going to a more powerful engine. They were reinforcing the wings to help with torque. And they started to add these little horizontals to the tanks in the back that really helped the aerodynamics of the whole system. The existing F-84Bs and Cs, the C was the same plane just with a slightly different engine from the B, received 100 upgrades, and the Ds would integrate all of these upgrades at the factory, plus the reinforced wings and things I was talking about. Well, later that year, this model, the E, came out, and it was even better. We're actually starting to get a reasonably competent plane now. The wings were further strengthened with a thicker skin. The body was lengthened a few inches front and back of the cockpit. That's to provide a bigger cockpit and also more room for electronics and avionics. It received a new fuel system that was winterized, so it wouldn't freeze up. It received a much more capable gun sight, and a few other differences. So they actually had a pretty decent version by the end of 1949, 1950, so prior to the Korean War. So what do we have here as far as the plane? Well, we're about 38 feet long. We have a wingspan of about 36.5 feet. Max speed is 622 miles per hour with a cruise speed of about 480. So they exceeded the requirements. It could hit Mach 0.8 and get up to about a 0.82, but then they would start having issues even with the improvements. Max altitude was about 40,500 feet. In addition to the 6 50 cal machine guns, each having 300 rounds, it could carry a payload under the wings of nearly 4,500 pounds. The E model would introduce additional drop tanks under the body there. It could also carry rockets and or bombs under the wings and racks. And while it wasn't the most impressive performer, and what ended up making it a great strike aircraft was, for one thing, it had pretty great acceleration. It had good handling characteristics once in the air. It wasn't really subject to crosswinds. It was a heavy enough plane that it was pretty stable. Thanks to its design, it made a very stable gun platform or rocket platform, and it could actually drop bombs with quite great accuracy from even high altitudes. And it could really take a licking. It was a very durable and dependable plane that it was less resource intensive to maintain than a lot of other jets of the day, probably because it was using older tech that was pretty well understood. On the flip side of that, early on, in late 40s, there was a lack of spare parts and also training for maintenance crews, so it was an issue, but that's not the plane's fault. That's a logistics, and at most a manufacturing issue. But this would, of course, be caught up with. One issue that really never got resolved was this needed a very high takeoff and landing speed because of its payload and relatively weak engine. Even though the engine would continue to be improved and upgraded, it was still relatively weak considering there's only one and it was lifting a considerable payload. It needed to get about 160 miles per hour to take off from the runway, which meant fully loaded it needed about 10,000 feet of runway. And this would lead to a lot of planes needing to use RADO bottles, basically rocket-assisted takeoff devices to successfully get off the ground, which would get it off the ground, but also would produce a ton of smoke, meaning most pilots would have to take off using instruments because of the smoke from the other planes. Luckily, this plane was pretty forgiving when it came to flying, and it had decent instrumentation in the cockpit to the point that it was relatively easy to fly on said instruments. Well, by 1950, it's a relatively mature design. The D and E's are in full production, and of course the Korean War gets kicked off. Well, initially, NATO, America, would mostly send F-51 Mustangs and F-80 Shooting Stars to Korea because North Korea didn't really have much of an air force. But in November of 1950, the MiG-15 would appear, a jet fighter, which would of course outclass the 51, and the F-80 wasn't much better off. As we know, in December they would rush F-86's Sabres to the theater, but they would also rush Thunderjets. So these would start off being used at the tail end of 1950. One of their first jobs was bomber escort and kind of fighter patrol. Unfortunately, the Thunderjet was a tad slower than the MiG and didn't have near the turning and all that, so it was outclassed by the MiG-15. But it was better than the Mustang or the Shooting Star. So they had to make do until there were enough Sabres. The first air-to-air victory for a Thunderjet happened in January of 1951. They shot down a MiG, but at the cost of 2 Thunderjets, so not a great ratio. But then they would actually find the plane's true calling as a low-level interdictor and strike bomber, along with introducing the definitive version, the G, in 1951. In Korea, they never sent over 84Bs and 84Cs. They just were never, even with the upgrades, fully combat capable in such an environment. So the Ds and the Es were the first. You might ask what happened to the F. Well, the F was almost a whole new design. At one time it was even going to be named the F-96. It was a swept wing version. And having swept wings in a jet really improves performance. This would be the F-84F Thunderstreak, but it would be delayed quite a long time until 1954, so it missed the Korean War. Instead, we ended up with the G. This would have another uprating to the engine, better engine. It would have a new canopy. It would have an improved gun sight. It would introduce an autopilot. It would also introduce aerial refueling for the first time. And it would be the first version that could carry a tactical nuclear bomb, although obviously it never deployed one in anger. It is considered the definitive version. You pretty much stretched the design, improved the design as much as possible, and it began to appear in Korea in 1952. And that's really when the plane found its groove. As a strike aircraft, as I said earlier, it was a very stable gun platform with 6 50 cal guns, plus carrying as much ordnance as half of what the old B-17 could. So pretty impressive. It carried rockets, dumb bombs, napalm. Also, because of its external fuel tanks, it could actually go quite a long ways and do aerial refueling, making it a very capable plane. So this would be called in to strike enemy troops, ammo dumps, facilities, whatever might need hitting on the ground. So much so that the Air Force credits the Thunderjet with taking out 60% of the total ground targets in the Korean War. Compare that to the 8 MiGs. These are credited with downing, and you really see where it was useful to them and where it wasn't. Yeah, it was a fighter bomber, much in the tradition of the later F-105 from Republic, and, eventually something like the A-10. By the end of the Korean War, this was a relatively outdated plane. Production would soon end. The older versions, the Bs, the Cs, the Ds, would be pulled out of active service by 1952. The Es would hang on to about 1956 in the U.S. Air Force, a little longer in the reserves, and the Gs here would be used until the mid-1960s, around 1964. They would build a bit over 7,500 all told. Another successful version was the RF-84, a reconnaissance version, the Thunder Flash, and actually a few of these would be kept in service until 1971 within the U.S. Air Force. So an unarmed photograph version would be used, and pretty successful. Again, stable platform, durable, could take a licking. And it was a pretty forgiving plane for the pilots, who generally speaking liked it. It kind of had a love-hate thing like a lot of these ground attack planes do in the Air Force. Had a lot of nicknames like the fastest tricycle in the world, the lead sled, the warthog, later just shortened to the hog, air-sucking hole, hence the big intake in the front, and probably the most interesting, ground-loving whore, because of its reluctance to get off the ground and needing such a long runway. There's even jokes about the dirt-sniffing device saying it wouldn't actually start to lift until it could smell the dirt at the end of an airfield. But, you know, it's one of those things that had a little bit of initial derision, but pilots were mixed on it. And of course, the Sabre was the sexier plane to fly. But then again, this had its thing. Where it was really loved was by the Army. Soldiers on the ground loved to see these things come in and hit the enemy, because they could deliver a good amount of ordnance and deliver it very accurately. So it was really a popular plane amongst doughboys in Korea. Really, after the Korean War, this would start to get spread out to American allies. In fact, this was the first jet to be fielded by West Germany, beginning in 1955. And West Germany would be the largest user outside of America for the Thunderjet. But it would also go to many other places, including Taiwan, Greece, Denmark, and so on and so forth. Because it had its attributes. It wasn't completely dated and useless. This was the first design, or fighter jet design, to be adopted and produced in numbers by the USA post-World War II. Keeping in mind that the P-80, the F-80, technically was in service before the end of the war. And the last Air Force to use it and retire it was actually Yugoslavia, who finally scrapped their Thunderjets, the remaining ones, in the 70s, with the last ones out of service in 1974. So for a first generation, or at most second generation jet, pretty decent little record. And I think it's a cool design. It has that kind of same aesthetic as the Meteor or the F-9F that the Air Force used, the Navy used around the same time. You know, that brief period of straight-winged jets. There's just not that many out there. Soon swept wings came into use. So that kind of old and new. I've talked about the models from Skymax before in other videos. It's essentially Hobbymaster, or at least the same people own them, but it was meant to be their more economy brand, but also brand to do lesser known, kind of more boutique planes. But I think they did a great job. Now, the stands have a little bit different shape. The top part's very Hobbymaster. The base is a little weirder and a little less stable. They do not have pilot figures, although I put a Hobby Master one in this one. This one doesn't. So that's one little corner they cut. But they still do have opening canopies, so you can put one in. They also come gear up or down, at least these do. Now the earliest Skymax models were just gear up, but they soon gave in and did gear up down. And they come with removable ordnance. And again, they're die-cast metal, 172 scale. If anything, they actually feel a little more durable than Hobby Master, because they tend to be a little chunkier, maybe a little less fine detail, fewer antennas, maybe a little bolder panel lines. But on the other hand, that does give you that extra durability. And there hasn't been an F-84 done in the Hobby Master line anyway, so yeah. This one I first picked up from Pete's. And it came as you see it here, although it did come with the 2 extra fuel tanks. I just don't have them attached. It did not come with the rockets to go under the wings. It does have these small rockets in the back, though. And I picked up this one, the E model, a little more recently from Aikens, just because I wanted to have an E and I liked them. And these are relatively affordable even today. They were $40, $50. And this one does have the rockets under the wings. And I have the tanks on it. Just to have kind of a different look. And again, they're technically different variants. At one time, it was discussed that Falcon would do the F-84F, the swept wing design, but unfortunately Falcon went out of business in 2004 before they could do it and other cool models. But yeah, everyone thinks of the Sabre, rightfully so. But don't forget about the Thunderjet. From nearly being canceled in 1948 to being the U.S. Air Force's #1 most effective and most heavily used strike fighter, strike bomber during the entirety of the Korean War. About 335 of these were lost during the war. But probably more would have been lost, except it was such a durable, dependable plane that could make it home even with a few bullet holes in it. Alrighty guys, well I better get back to work. I just felt like doing one video. I haven't done one in a couple of days. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. And if you could, check out my other videos and like, share, and subscribe, and I will get to the Sabre and other planes very soon. I just kind of felt like starting here. Why not? Be a little different. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.